The sun was beginning its slow, agonizing crawl toward the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Estates. I sat on my porch, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching a silver sedan creep past my driveway for the third time that hour. It wasn't just a car, it was a mobile surveillance unit. Behind those tinted windows, someone was taking notes on the length of my grass or the exact shade of my porch furniture. I didn't move, I didn't even blink. I just took a sip, the ice clinking softly against the glass, the only sound in a neighborhood that felt like a high-security prison disguised as a suburban paradise. They call her Karen, not her actual name of course, but the title she's earned through years of dedicated service to the art of being a nuisance. She's the president of the HOA, a woman who treats the bylaws like the Ten Commandments and herself like the burning bush. For months, she's made it her mission to break me. She thinks she's playing a game of chess. What she doesn't realize is that I'm the one who built the board. The architect of a sanctuary. I bought this place 12 years ago. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't an inheritance. It was the result of 80-hour workweeks, missed holidays, and a decade of grinding in the real estate law sector. I'm James Parker. In my professional life, I'm a property rights advocate. I spend my days protecting people from the very thing that was currently parked across the street. My home was my sanctuary, a 3-acre slice of peace at the end of a cul-de-sac. I'd spent thousands on landscaping, turning a barren lot into a private forest. But in Karen's eyes, a private forest is just a collection of unauthorized biological obstructions. It started with a flyer, then a letter, then a formal notice. My grass was the wrong shade of emerald. My oak tree had a branch that threatened the aesthetic continuity of the sidewalk. It was laughable at first, then it became a full-time job. The escalation. The real war began with the pool fence. I value my privacy. When I put in the lap pool, I installed a 6-foot cedar fence, professional grade, perfectly leveled and fully compliant with city zoning codes. 2 days after it went up, I found Karen standing in my driveway. She didn't knock, she was just there, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon, her face set in that permanent expression of smelling something sour. "Mr. Parker," she said, not looking at me but at the fence. "This is a violation, Article 4, Section 2, fences shall not exceed 5 feet, and the HOA requires unobstructed visual access for safety inspections." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "The city code says 6 feet for pool safety, Karen, to prevent, toddlers from drowning. I think life trumps aesthetics." She finally looked at me, her eyes cold and clinical. "The city doesn't run Oak Ridge, Mr. Parker. I do. You have 5 days to lower it or we will authorize a crew to do it for you, and we'll send you the bill." "I wouldn't recommend that," I said quietly. My voice was calm, it's always calm. That's what bothers people like her the most. They want you to scream so they can play the victim. I just smiled. "Have a nice day, Karen." The shadow war. Over the next month, the fines began to pile up like autumn leaves. $50 for a stray weed, $100 for unauthorized window treatments, $500 for the fence. Every time I opened my mailbox, it was another white envelope with the HOA seal, a logo that was starting to look more like a crest of arms for a feudal lord. But Karen wasn't satisfied with financial ruin. She wanted social execution. I started noticing the shift at the grocery store. Susan, a woman I'd shared gardening tips with for years, saw me in the produce aisle and immediately pivoted her cart 180 degrees. At the local diner, the reserved signs started appearing on tables whenever I walked in. Karen had been busy. She spent the monthly mixers spinning a narrative. James Parker was a danger to property values. A renegade who didn't care about the safety of our children. She'd even hinted that my advocacy work was just a cover for something more litigious and sinister. She was isolating me, turning my sanctuary into a cell. One evening, as I was walking to my car, the silver sedan, the one that had been stalking me, pulled up close. The window rolled down just an inch. I saw the glint of a camera lens. I didn't hide, I didn't cover my face. I walked right up to the window and tapped on the glass with my wedding ring. Clink, clink, clink. "Make sure you get my good side," I said to the dark glass. "And tell Karen if she wants a photo of my backyard, she can just ask. It'll save her the gas money." The car sped off, tires screeching. The breaking point. The pressure was starting to bleed into my work. Clients, some of whom lived in the surrounding developments, started calling to postpone our meetings. My reputation, the one thing I'd spent my life building, was being eroded by the whispers of a woman who spent her afternoons measuring blade heights of fescue. I was tired, I was losing sleep, I was losing money, but more importantly, I was losing my patience. I decided to do something I rarely do. I asked for a meeting. I wanted to see the monster in her lair. Corinne's house was a monument to beige. Everything was symmetrical, sterile, and utterly devoid of soul. She invited me in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "I'm glad you've seen reason, James," she said, pouring tea into a delicate china cup. "The board is prepared to waive 50% of the fines if you remove the fence and issue a formal apology in the newsletter." I sat on her pristine white sofa looking around. A formal apology for what exactly? Protecting my property. "For being difficult?" she snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "You think you're above the rules because you're a lawyer, but in this neighborhood I am the law. We have eyes everywhere. We know when you leave, when you come home, who stays over. We know everything." I set my tea down. I hadn't touched it. "That sounds a lot like harassment, Corinne, possibly stalking." She laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "It's community oversight, and the police agree with me. I've already briefed the local precinct on your aggressive behavior. If you so much as raise your voice to me, I'll have a cruiser here in 3 minutes." I nodded slowly, absorbing the depth of her delusion. She didn't just want a pretty neighborhood. She wanted a kingdom. She had co-opted the neighbors, the board, and even hinted at the local authorities. "You've really thought this through," I said, my voice dripping with mock admiration. "I always do," she smirked. "So do we have a deal, or do I have to proceed with the lien on your house?" I stood up, smoothing my jacket. "You do what you have to do, Corinne, but remember, when you play for stakes this high, you'd better make sure you're the one holding the cards." The reckoning. 2 weeks later, the climax arrived. I was in my backyard when I heard the heavy rumble of machinery. I walked around to the front to find a flatbed truck, a small bulldozer, and Corinne standing on my sidewalk like a conquering general. 2 police cruisers were parked behind her, lights flashing but sirens silent. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered. Susan was there, so was the mailman. Everyone was watching the troublemaker get what he deserved. "Mr. Parker," Corinne shouted over the engine noise. "You were warned. We are here to remove the non-compliant structure under the emergency powers of the HOA board." I walked down my driveway, hands in my pockets, perfectly calm. I didn't look at the bulldozer. I looked at the lead officer, Officer Miller, a man I'd seen around but never spoken to. "Officer," I said, "I assume you're here to keep the peace." "That's right, Mr. Parker," Miller said, looking a bit uncomfortable. "The HOA has provided documentation that this fence is an illegal structure on private common shared easement. They have a right to remove it." I turned to Corinne. She was beaming. This was her moment of absolute triumph. She was going to tear down my sanctuary in front of the whole world. "Corinne," I said, pitching my voice so the neighbors could hear, "before you drop that blade, I want to give you one last chance to go home. Take the truck, take the cops, and let's pretend this was just a very expensive mistake on your part." "Start the engine," she shrieked to the driver. "Wait," I said, holding up a single finger. "Just one question, did you check the new survey?" Corinne paused, her brow furrowing. "What survey? The plot maps are 30 years old. We use the master deed." I pulled a folded document from my back pocket and handed it to Officer Miller. "See, that's the problem with 30-year-old maps," I said, my sarcastic edge finally sharpening into a blade. "They don't account for scrivener's errors in the original county filings. You see, I spent the last month doing more than just drinking bourbon on my porch. I went to the county assessor's office. I went to the state land bureau." Officer Miller opened the document, his eyes widened. "What is that?" Corinne demanded, stepping forward. "It's a corrected deed and a jurisdictional map," I said, stepping into her personal space. She tried to maintain her ground, but I could see the first flicker of doubt in her eyes. "You see, Corinne, because of a clerical error back in 1992, the boundary for Oak Ridge Estates actually ends exactly 12 feet before my property line." The silence that followed was deafening. The bulldozer engine sputtered. "What are you talking about?" Corinne hissed. I'm talking about the fact that my house and the 3 acres it sits on is not and has never been part of the Oak Ridge HOA, I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. I'm an enclave, a sovereign hole in the middle of your map. I don't owe you fines, I don't owe you visual access. And I certainly don't owe you an apology. Karen's face went from pale to a deep bruised purple. That's impossible, you pay dues. I paid voluntary contributions because I liked the streetlights, I corrected. But those stopped last month, and since I'm not in your HOA, Karen, do you know what this bulldozer is? I looked at Officer Miller. He looked at the bulldozer, then at the map, then back at Karen. Ma'am, Miller said, his voice stern now. If that machine touches that fence, it's criminal trespass and felony destruction of property. And since you've been using the police department to facilitate a private vendetta on land outside your jurisdiction, well, that's a whole different set of problems for you. The twist. The neighbors began to murmur. The villain wasn't the one breaking the rules, the queen was the one who didn't even have a throne. But I wasn't done. Oh, and Karen, about that silver sedan, I pulled out my phone. I have 48 hours of high-definition footage of your oversight committee stalking me on private property, and since I'm not under your HOA bylaws, I'm under state privacy laws. I filed the harassment and stalking charges this morning. The sheriff should be at your house in about 10 minutes. The clipboard slipped from her hands. It hit the pavement with a hollow thwack. The crowd of neighbors, the ones who had turned their backs on me, were now staring at her with a mixture of horror and realization. They had been led by a woman who had no power, and she had just led them into a legal minefield. One more thing, I said, leaning in close so only she could hear. I bought the debt on the HOA's common area last week through a holding company. Since you've been overspending on surveillance and legal fees to harass me, the HOA is technically insolvent. I'll be seeing you at the next meeting, not as a resident, but as your primary creditor. I turned around and walked back up my driveway. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I heard the truck engine die. I heard the police officers telling the crowd to disperse. And I heard the sound of Karen's world, the one she had built on a foundation of control and lies, finally beautifully collapsing. I sat back down on my porch, picked up my bourbon, and took a sip. The ice was gone, but the drink was still cold. And for the first time in months, the neighborhood was finally, truly quiet.